The European Commission last week proposed Sri Lanka is granted GSP Plus concessions. This comes as a major victory for Sri Lanka, which has been lobbying since June to regain the trade concessions. President Sirisena and Prime Minister Ranil Wickramasinghe, in fact, hailed it a major foreign policy achievement by the National Unity Government. But what led to this development and what does it mean for us? Find out on News Matters. In 2010, the European Union withdrew trade concessions to Sri Lanka, citing dismal human rights records and governance under the previous regime. The Unity government, no sooner it assumed office in 2015, made regaining the trade concessions one of its key priorities. This meant focusing heavily on restoring human rights and democratic values, which it has done over the past 2 years. Sri Lanka formally applied for GSP Plus concessions in June 2016. On Wednesday last week, the European Commission, after 6 months of intense deliberation, finally declared Sri Lanka fit to receive GSP Plus concessions. These trade concessions, once granted, will allow over 1,200 Sri Lankan products to reach the European markets minus all export tariffs. This makes a special sense when you take into account the fact that the EU is Sri Lanka's biggest export market, accounting for 36% of its total annual exports. But while the European Commission has declared that Sri Lanka meets the eligibility criteria of Article 9(1) of the GSP regulation, its proposal recommending Sri Lanka receive GSP Plus trade concessions will have to receive the approval of all 28 EU member states first, as well as the EU Parliament. The European Commission's proposal recommending Sri Lanka for GSP Plus trade concessions was presented to EU Parliament yesterday, and an answer should be forthcoming, although the entire process will take between 2 to 4 months. Sri Lanka can't rest on her laurels in the meantime either. She has to work hard to ensure she meets areas cited as shortcomings by the European Union, and this includes constitutional reforms and the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The European Commission, in its assessment, said the monitoring bodies of the relevant conventions have detected salient shortcomings in connection to the above listed conventions. The Commission will be paying particular attention to the identified salient shortcomings in its monitoring of the effective implementation of these conventions. This is why the Sri Lankan government is now rushing to fast-track the implementation of the National Human Rights Action Plan, a prerequisite for GSP Plus. This was discussed at last week's cabinet meeting chaired by President Sirisena. The National Human Rights Action Plan proposes to repeal the Vagrants Ordinance of 1842 used specifically against street sex workers and transgender persons, reform the Evidence Ordinance to remove discriminatory provisions on the credibility of women's evidence, including the need for independent corroboration, initiate reform of Muslim personal laws, based on recommendations made by the Independent Committee on Muslim Personal Law Reforms in 2010, take steps to ensure that employers in public and private sectors introduce mandatory guidelines and appoint committees to respond to sexual harassment and the abuse of women in consultation with trade unions and employer federations, the exception of girls below 12 years to accommodate Muslim personal law to express a general norm in the way it has been done in other areas of the criminal justice system, to criminalize marital rape without any exceptions, including where spouses are judicially separated, to decriminalize homosexuality by repealing Section 365A of the Penal Code to conform to Article 12 of the Constitution, and a few other reforms. However, there are divergent views among members of the government on some sections of the National Human Rights Action Plan, and the government is now in the process of tying up those loose ends. However, last-minute negotiations between the government and the EU over the implementation of some of the conditions relating to GSP Plus can be expected. The benefits of GSP Plus are two-pronged. While boosting the country's export sector, it also encourages much-needed and constructive legal reforms, some of which are long overdue. And this is why regaining GSP Plus trade concessions after a hiatus of 6 years is considered the most important foreign policy achievement of this unity government. And this is why regaining GSP Plus trade concessions after a hiatus of 6 years is considered the most important foreign policy achievement of this unity government. See you again with another segment on Friday. I am Royal Raymond.